Jake had been the king of Lincoln High School for 3 long years. At 17, he stood nearly 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and a permanent scowl that made even some teachers uncomfortable. He had built his reputation on making other kids' lives miserable, and he was good at it. The thing about Jake was that he never picked random targets. He was smart about it, calculating even. He would watch new students for weeks, studying them like a hunter studies prey. He looked for the quiet ones, the kids who ate lunch alone, the ones who never raised their hands in class. He wanted victims. Who wouldn't fight back, who wouldn't tell anyone, who would just take whatever he dished out. His methods were cruel but clever. Jake never left marks that would get him suspended. Instead, he would bump into kids in crowded hallways, making it look like an accident while whispering threats in their ears. He would steal homework and throw it in the trash, then watch as his victims got in trouble with teachers. He had perfected the art of making someone's day terrible without getting caught. The teachers at Lincoln High either didn't see what was happening or pretended not to. Mrs. Rodriguez, the math teacher, would turn away when Jake cornered kids. By their lockers, Mr. Peterson, who taught history, would suddenly become very interested in his paperwork whenever Jake started his intimidation games. The principal, Mr. Williams, seemed to think Jake was just a normal teenager going through a phase. Jake's victims never spoke up. They were too scared, too ashamed, or too convinced that nobody would believe them. He had broken their spirit so completely that they just accepted their fate. Some kids even switched schools to escape him. Jake saw this as proof of his power, and it only made him bolder. The cafeteria was Jake's favorite hunting ground. During lunch, he would walk around like he owned the place, taking food from smaller kids' trays, knocking over drinks, and making jokes at their expense. Other students would laugh nervously, grateful they weren't the target. Jake fed off their fear and respect. He had a group of friends who followed him around, but they weren't really friends. They were more like scared followers who stayed close to Jake because they were terrified of becoming his next victim. Tommy, a chubby kid with glasses, would laugh at Jake's cruel jokes even when they made him feel sick inside. Brad, who was almost as tall as Jake but much skinnier, would hold kids down while Jake went through their backpacks. Jake's home life wasn't much better than his school life, but he never let anyone know that. His father worked double shifts at the factory and was rarely home. When he was around, he was usually drunk and angry. His mother had left when Jake was 12, and he blamed everyone else for the pain he felt inside. Taking it out on weaker kids made him feel powerful, made him feel like he had control over something in his life. The worst part about Jake's bullying was how systematic it was. He would pick a victim and then slowly destroy their confidence. Over months, he would start small, with little comments about their clothes or their appearance. Then he would move on to physical intimidation, standing too close, blocking their path in hallways, making them feel trapped and helpless. He had driven at least 5 kids to change schools over the years. There was Kevin, a small kid who loved to read, whom Jake tormented until his parents moved him to a private school across town. There was Lisa, a quiet girl who played violin, whom Jake humiliated so badly that she begged her parents to homeschool her. Each time a victim disappeared, Jake felt a twisted sense of accomplishment. The other students at Lincoln High had learned to stay invisible when Jake was around. They would take longer routes to class to avoid him, eat lunch in empty classrooms, and keep their heads down in the hallways. The whole school lived in fear of one 17-year-old boy, and somehow that had become normal. Jake's favorite time of day was between classes when the hallways were crowded and chaotic. He would position himself near the most popular lockers and wait for the perfect moment to strike. A shoulder check here, a backpack knocked to the ground there. Always with a crowd of witnesses who were too scared to intervene. He had developed a reputation that extended beyond the school walls. Middle school kids who were coming to Lincoln High next year had already heard stories about Jake. Parents in the community whispered about him at PTA meetings, but nobody wanted to be the one to actually confront the problem. It was easier to tell their kids to just stay away from him. Jake's teachers had given up trying to control him years ago. He was smart enough to keep his grades just high enough to stay on the basketball team, even though he barely played. The Coach, Mr. Thompson, needed every player he could get, so he ignored Jake's behavior as long as it didn't happen during practice. The really sad thing was that Jake had once been different. In elementary school, he had been a normal kid who liked cartoons and playing with toy cars. But years of watching his parents fight, of feeling abandoned and angry, had twisted him into something else. He had learned that being feared was better than being ignored, that causing pain was better than feeling it. By his senior year, Jake had become a legend at Lincoln High, but not the good kind. New students were warned about him on their first day. Teachers would rearrange seating charts to keep potential victims away from him. The school had even hired an extra security guard, though they never admitted it was because of Jake. But Jake's biggest mistake was thinking that his system was foolproof. He believed that all quiet kids were weak, that all loners were easy targets, that anyone who didn't fight back was someone he could control. He had gotten so comfortable with his power that he stopped being careful about who he chose to torment. That's when he noticed the new kid, a transfer student who had started at Lincoln High in the middle of the semester. The boy was small, maybe 5'6", with dark hair and clothes that looked like they came from a thrift store. He sat alone at lunch, never spoke up in class, and seemed to have no friends at all. To Jake, he looked like the perfect victim. The new kid's name was Alex. And from the moment Jake saw him, he knew he had found his next target. Alex seemed to go out of his way to avoid attention, keeping his head down and staying quiet. He was exactly the type of kid Jake had been tormenting for years. What Jake didn't know was that Alex's silence wasn't about fear or weakness. It was about something much more dangerous than Jake could ever imagine. Jake started small with Alex, just like he always did. It began with little things that most people wouldn't even notice. He would walk past Alex's desk and accidentally knock his pencil to the floor. He would bump into him in the hallway and mutter a fake apology. He would sit near Alex during lunch and make loud comments about how some kids looked like they shopped at garage sales. Alex never reacted. He would just pick up his pencil, step aside when Jake bumped him, and continue eating his lunch in silence. To Jake, this was perfect. It meant Alex was going to be an easy target, someone who wouldn't cause him any trouble. But what Jake didn't realize was that Alex's calm reaction wasn't about being scared. It was something else entirely. After a week of these small tests, Jake decided to step things up. He started following Alex between classes, walking just close, enough to make him uncomfortable. He would stand behind Alex in the lunch line and make comments about how some kids probably couldn't afford real food. He would sit in the library when Alex was there, staring at him until Alex packed up his books and left. The other students noticed what was happening. They had seen this pattern before with Jake's previous victims. Some of them felt bad for Alex, but nobody wanted to get involved. Getting on Jake's bad side meant becoming his next target, and everyone knew that. So they just watched and stayed quiet, the same way they always did. Jake's friends started joining in on the harassment. Tommy would laugh extra loud whenever Jake made a joke about Alex's clothes. Brad would block Alex's path in the hallway, forcing him to take the long way around. They were like a pack of wolves, circling their prey and getting ready to strike. Alex's teachers started to notice that something was wrong. He had been a good student when he first arrived, always turning in his homework on time and paying attention in class. But now he seemed distracted, like his mind was somewhere else. Mrs. Patterson, his English teacher, wondered if he was having trouble adjusting to the new school. She thought about asking him if everything was okay, but she was busy with 30 other students and eventually forgot about it. Jake was enjoying himself more than usual. There was something about Alex that made the bullying feel even more satisfying. Maybe it was because Alex was so quiet, so controlled. Jake was used to kids who would eventually crack, who would cry or beg him to stop. But Alex just took everything, without showing any emotion at all. It was like a challenge, and Jake loved challenges. The turning point came during third period on a Tuesday. Jake was walking past Alex's locker when he decided to try something new. He grabbed Alex's backpack right out of his hands and started going through it. He pulled out notebooks, textbooks, and a small lunch bag. Other students stopped to watch, forming a circle around them like they were watching a fight. Alex stood perfectly still, watching Jake rifle through his belongings. He didn't try to stop him or ask for his things back. He just waited, his face completely blank. This made Jake even more excited. He loved it when his victims were too scared to fight back. Inside Alex's backpack, Jake found something interesting. There was a small notebook, different from the school notebooks. It was black and looked like it was well used. Jake opened it and started reading out loud, thinking it might be a diary or something embarrassing he could use against Alex, but the notebook wasn't what he expected. It was filled with notes, but not the kind of notes a normal high school student would take. There were observations about people, detailed descriptions of daily routines, and what looked like some kind of code. Jake couldn't understand most of it, but he could tell it was important to Alex because it was the first time he saw any emotion on the boy's face. For just a moment, Alex's calm mask slipped, his eyes went hard and his jaw tightened. He took a step forward and Jake actually felt a chill run down his spine. But then Alex stopped, took a deep breath, and his face went blank again. He held out his hand, silently asking for his notebook back. Jake wasn't about to give up his advantage. He held the notebook over his head, just out of Alex's reach. The crowd of students was getting bigger, and Jake was loving the attention. He started making jokes about Alex's weird notes, calling him a freak and a weirdo. Some of the other students laughed, but their laughter sounded nervous. That's when Jake made his biggest mistake yet. He threw the notebook across the hallway, and it landed in a puddle of water from a leaky water fountain. The pages got soaked, and Alex's careful notes started to blur and run. For the first time since he had started at Lincoln High, Alex's control cracked. Alex walked over to the puddle and carefully picked up his ruined notebook. He looked at the damaged pages for a long moment, then looked up at Jake. There was something in his eyes that made Jake take a step back. It wasn't fear or sadness. It was something much more dangerous, but Alex didn't say anything. He just put the wet notebook in his backpack and walked away, leaving Jake standing in the hallway with a crowd of students staring at him. Jake tried to laugh it off, making jokes about how Alex was probably going to cry about his stupid notebook. But something about the way Alex had looked at him made Jake feel uneasy. The next day, Jake decided to make sure everyone knew that Alex was his victim. During lunch, he walked over to Alex's table and sat down across from him. Alex was eating a simple sandwich and reading a book, completely ignoring Jake's presence. Jake started talking loudly about how some kids didn't belong at Lincoln High, how they should go back to whatever rock they crawled out from under. He was putting on a show for the other students, making sure they all knew that Alex was under his control. But Alex just kept reading his book, turning pages like Jake wasn't even there. This made Jake angry. He was used to getting reactions from his victims, even if it was just fear in their eyes. But Alex was treating him like he was invisible, like he didn't matter at all. Jake reached across the table and slammed Alex's book shut, forcing him to pay attention. Alex looked up slowly, and again Jake saw that strange, cold look in his eyes. But Alex didn't say anything. He just packed up his lunch, picked up his book, and walked away. Jake was left sitting at the table, feeling like he had somehow lost, even though Alex hadn't fought back. The other students were starting to whisper about what was happening. They had never seen anyone react to Jake's bullying the way Alex did. Most kids would either fight back or completely break down, but Alex did neither. He just absorbed everything Jake threw at him and kept going like nothing had happened. Jake's friends were starting to feel uncomfortable too. Tommy mentioned that maybe they should leave Alex alone, that there was something weird about him. Brad agreed, saying that Alex gave him the creeps, but Jake wasn't about to back down. He had built his reputation on breaking kids like Alex, and he wasn't going to let one quiet transfer student ruin that. So Jake decided to take things to the next level. He was going to make Alex's life so miserable that he would have no choice but to either fight back or leave the school. Jake had no idea that Alex was already planning his own response, and that Jake's escalation was about to backfire in ways he could never imagine. What nobody at Lincoln High knew was that Alex carried a secret that would have changed everything if they had known about it. A quiet, Seemingly helpless boy that Jake had chosen as his next victim was actually one of the most dangerous people in the entire school. But Alex had spent years learning how to hide that side of himself. Alex's real name was Alexander Chun, and he had moved to Lincoln High in the middle of the semester for a very specific reason. His previous school had been a military academy, where he had been training since he was 12 years old. His father, Colonel Robert Chun, had been a decorated officer in the Special Forces before he was killed in action 2 years earlier. Alex's mother, trying to give her son a normal teenage experience, had decided to enroll him in regular public school. The notebook that Jake had thrown into the puddle wasn't just random notes. It was a detailed observation log that Alex had been keeping since his first day at Lincoln High. Every entry was written in a code that his father had taught him, documenting patterns of behavior, potential threats, and escape routes throughout the school building. Alex had been trained to always be aware of his surroundings, to catalog everything and everyone around him. His father had started teaching Alex self-defense when he was just 6 years old. By the time he was 10, Alex could disarm an adult twice his size. By 12, he had learned techniques that were only taught to elite military units. But along with these deadly skills came a strict code of conduct that his father had drilled into him. Never use your training unless someone's life is in immediate danger. Never let anger control your actions. And always remember that your skills are meant to protect, not to harm. The reason Alex never fought back against Jake wasn't because he was scared or weak. It was because he had made a promise to his dying father that he would never use his abilities to hurt someone unless it was absolutely necessary. His father had seen too many soldiers lose themselves to violence, and he had made Alex swear that he would be different, that he would be better, but keeping that promise was getting harder every day. Alex's military training had taught him to recognize patterns, and he could see exactly what Jake was doing. He knew that Jake was following the classic pattern of an escalating bully, and Alex could predict almost exactly what would happen next. The problem was that Alex also knew how these situations usually ended, and it wasn't good for anyone involved. Alex's mother, Dr. Sarah Chun, was a therapist who specialized in helping military families adjust to civilian life. She had noticed that Alex was struggling with the transition to regular school, but she thought it was just normal adjustment issues. She had no idea that her son was dealing with a systematic campaign of bullying because Alex had never told her about Jake. The truth was that Alex was protecting more than just himself. He had been quietly watching Jake's behavior for weeks, and he had identified at least 6 other students who were also being targeted. There was Riley, a freshman who Jake cornered in the bathroom every Tuesday. There was Sam, a sophomore who Jake had been stealing money from for months. There was Jordan, a junior who had stopped eating lunch because Jake would take his food every day. Alex had been documenting all of this in his notebook, building a comprehensive case against Jake. He had taken photos of bruises, recorded conversations, and even managed to get video evidence of some of Jake's worst behavior. Alex's plan was to present all of this evidence to the school administration and the police, creating such an overwhelming case that Jake would face serious consequences. But Alex's military training had also taught him something else. Sometimes, the best way to protect people is to eliminate the threat completely. And Jake was definitely a threat. Alex had seen what happened to kids who were bullied the way Jake bullied people. Some of them never recovered. Some of them hurt themselves rather than face another day of torment. Alex couldn't let that happen, not when he had the power to stop it. The notebook that Jake had destroyed contained months of careful work. Alex had been planning to turn in his evidence at the end of the week, but now half of his documentation was ruined. Worse than that, Jake had seen some of the contents of the notebook, and Alex knew that Jake was smart enough to realize that something was different about the new kid. That night, Alex sat in his room staring at the water-damaged notebook. He could still read most of it, but some crucial pages were completely illegible. He thought about his father's teachings, about the promise he had made, and about the other students who were counting on him to do something about Jake, even though they didn't know it. Alex's mother knocked on his door and came in to say goodnight. She noticed the damaged notebook on his desk and asked what had happened to it. Alex told her he had accidentally spilled water on it, and she offered to help him rewrite whatever pages were ruined. Alex thanked her but said he could handle it himself. He couldn't tell her the truth about what was really happening at school. After his mother left, Alex opened his closet and pulled out a small wooden box that had belonged to his father. Inside were his father's military medals, including the Purple Heart he had received for being wounded in combat. Alex held the medals in his hands and thought about the man who had earned them, the man who had taught him everything he knew about fighting and about honor. His father had always said that the hardest battles weren't against enemy soldiers, but against the darkness inside yourself. He had taught Alex that true strength came from knowing when not to fight, but also from knowing when fighting was the only option left. Alex was starting to think that he might be reaching that point with Jake. The next morning, Alex made a decision. That would change everything. He was going to give Jake one more chance to back down, one final opportunity to stop his bullying and leave the other students alone. If Jake took that chance, Alex would stick to his original plan and let the authorities handle the situation. But if Jake continued to escalate, if he pushed things too far, then Alex would have to make a choice between his promise to his father and his duty to protect the innocent. Alex had been trained for war, but he had never imagined that his biggest battle would be in a high school hallway against a 17-year-old bully. He had learned to fight enemies who were trying to kill him, but Jake was different. Jake was someone who fed on fear and weakness, someone who had never faced a real threat in his life. Alex knew that if it came down to a confrontation, Jake would have no idea what he was dealing with. But Alex also knew that once he crossed that line, once he broke his promise to his father, there would be no going back. He would become something different, something that his father had tried to prevent him from becoming. The question was whether he could live with that choice, or whether he could find another way to stop Jake before it was too late. As Alex walked into Lincoln High that morning, he had no idea that Jake was already planning his next move. Something so public and humiliating that it would force Alex to make the choice he had been dreading. The quiet war between them was about to become very loud, and only one of them would walk away unchanged. The next morning started like any other day at Lincoln High, but Alex knew it would be different. He had barely slept the night before, thinking about his father's medals and the promise he had made. As he walked through the school parking lot, he could feel that something was about to change. He just didn't know how dramatically. Jake had spent the previous evening planning something special for Alex. He was tired of the quiet kid's lack of reaction, tired of not getting the fear and respect he was used to. Jake had decided that today would be the day he broke Alex completely in front of the entire school. He wanted everyone to see that no one could ignore Jake Thompson and get away with it. The morning classes went by normally. Alex sat in his usual spots, took his usual notes, and kept his head down like always. But teachers who knew him well noticed something different. Mrs. Patterson saw that Alex kept checking the clock, like he was waiting for something. Mr. Rodriguez noticed that Alex's hands were completely steady, even steadier than usual, like he was in some kind of zone. Jake was also acting differently. He was more excited than usual, whispering to his friends about something big that was going to happen at lunch. Tommy and Brad kept asking him what he was planning, but Jake just smiled and told them to wait and see. He wanted it to be a surprise for everyone, including Alex. When lunchtime came, Alex walked into the cafeteria like he did every day. He got his usual simple lunch and sat at his usual table in the corner. But instead of pulling out a book to read, he just sat there, looking around the room like he was studying every face, every exit, every detail. His military training had taught him to always know his surroundings, and today that training was fully activated. Jake waited until the cafeteria was completely full. He wanted maximum audience for what he was about to do. He stood up from his table and walked over to where Alex was sitting. His friends followed him, and soon other students started to notice what was happening. Conversations got quieter as more and more people turned to watch. Alex looked up as Jake approached, and for the first time in weeks, he made direct eye contact with his tormentor. Jake was surprised by what he saw in Alex's eyes. There was no fear, no pleading, no desperation. There was just a calm, cold focus that made Jake hesitate for just a moment, but Jake had committed to his plan, and he wasn't going to back down. Now, he reached down and grabbed Alex's lunch tray, lifting it up and dumping the entire contents over Alex's head. Food and milk splattered everywhere, covering Alex's hair and clothes. The cafeteria went completely silent as everyone watched. To see what would happen next, Alex sat perfectly still for a moment, with food dripping from his hair and milk soaking through his shirt. Then, very slowly, he reached up and wiped the milk from his eyes. He looked at Jake, who was standing over him with a huge grin on his face, waiting for the reaction he had been trying to get for weeks, instead of the tears or anger that Jake expected. Alex did something that surprised everyone. He smiled. It wasn't a happy smile or a scared smile. It was the kind of smile that made everyone in the cafeteria feel uncomfortable, like they were seeing something they weren't supposed to see. Alex stood up slowly, and as he did, Jake noticed something he had never seen before. The way Alex moved was different from other kids. He moved like a trained athlete, like someone who knew exactly what his body could do. Every movement was controlled, precise, purposeful. Jake took a step back, suddenly feeling like maybe he had made a mistake. But it was too late to back down now. The entire cafeteria was watching, and Jake's reputation depended on finishing what he had started. He reached out to push Alex back down into his chair, expecting the same passive response he had always gotten, but this time, Alex didn't just stand there and take it. As Jake's hand came toward him, Alex moved faster than anyone thought possible. He caught Jake's wrist in a grip that was so strong it made Jake gasp in pain. For a moment, the two boys stood there frozen, with Alex holding Jake's wrist in a grip that felt like it could break bones. The students watching couldn't believe what they were seeing. Quiet, passive Alex had just caught Jake's hand like it was nothing. Jake, who had never met anyone who could match his strength, was suddenly facing someone who made him feel small and weak. Alex looked directly into Jake's eyes and spoke for the first time since Jake had started bullying him. His voice was quiet, but in the silent cafeteria, everyone could hear every word clearly. He said, "You need to stop. This ends now." Jake tried to pull his wrist away, but Alex's grip was like iron. Jake had never felt anything like it. He started to panic, realizing that he was in a situation he had never been in before. For the first time in his life, Jake was the one who was helpless, the one who couldn't fight back. Alex held Jake's wrist for just a few more seconds, then released it. Jake stumbled backward, rubbing his wrist and staring at Alex in shock. The entire cafeteria was completely silent, waiting to see what would happen next. Nobody moved, nobody spoke, nobody even seemed to breathe. Then Alex did something that nobody expected. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a folder that was thick with papers and photographs. He set it on the table in front of him and opened it, revealing months of documentation about Jake's bullying. There were photos of bruises on other students, recorded conversations, witness statements, and detailed logs of every incident Jake had been involved in. Alex's voice was still, quiet, but it carried clearly through the silent cafeteria. He said, "I know about Riley, I know about Sam, I know about Jordan, I know about all of them." He looked directly at Jake, who was still backing away. "I know about everything you've done, and I have proof." Jake's face went white as he realized what Alex was showing him. All of his careful planning, all of his methods of staying under the radar had been completely exposed. Alex had been watching him, documenting everything, building a case against him that would destroy his life. But Alex wasn't finished. He pulled out his phone and showed Jake the screen. On it was a video of Jake cornering Riley in the bathroom, threatening him and taking his lunch money. Jake's own voice was clearly audible on the recording, and his face was clearly visible in the video. Alex said, "I have 23 videos like this one. I have recordings of you threatening students. I have photos of injuries you've caused. I have witness statements from kids who were too scared to speak up before." He paused, looking around the cafeteria at all the students who were watching. "And all of this evidence is already in the hands of Principal Williams, the police, and the school district office." Jake felt like the floor was falling out from under him. Everything he had built, his entire reputation, his control over the school, was crumbling in front of the entire cafeteria. But the worst part was that Alex wasn't finished with him yet. Alex stood up and walked closer to Jake, who continued backing away until he hit a wall. Alex stopped just close enough to speak quietly, but his words were still audible to the students, who were closest to them. He said, "You picked the wrong person to mess with. You thought I was weak because I didn't fight back, but I wasn't being weak. I was being smart. I was building a case against you that will follow you for the rest of your life." Jake wanted to run, wanted to escape from this nightmare, but his legs felt like they wouldn't work. He was trapped, surrounded by witnesses, facing someone who had completely outmaneuvered him. For the first time in his life, Jake understood what it felt like to be the victim, to be completely powerless against someone stronger and smarter than himself. Alex picked up his folder and walked toward the cafeteria exit as he passed. "Jake," he said one final thing that made Jake's blood run cold. "This is over. You're done hurting people. And if you ever try to retaliate against me or anyone else, remember that I know things about fighting that you can't even imagine." The silence in the cafeteria lasted for what felt like hours after Alex walked out, but it was probably only about 30 seconds. Then, all at once, everyone started talking. Students were pulling out their phones, texting frantically, calling their friends who weren't there to tell them what had just happened. The quiet kid that nobody had paid attention to had just taken down the most feared bully in school, and he had done it without throwing a single punch. Jake stood against the wall for several minutes, unable to move. His friends Tommy and Brad didn't know what to do. They had never seen Jake look scared before, and they definitely had never seen him completely defeated. Other students were staring at Jake, but not with the fear and respect he was used to. Now they were looking at him like he was just another kid, maybe even someone to feel sorry for. Within an hour, word of what had happened spread throughout the entire school. Students who had missed the cafeteria showdown heard about it from their friends. Teachers started hearing whispers in the hallways. By the end of the day, everyone at Lincoln High knew that Jake's reign of terror was over, and they knew exactly how it had ended, but the real consequences were just beginning. Principal Williams had indeed received Alex's folder of evidence, just like Alex had said. The principal had been looking through the documentation all morning, and what he found made him sick to his stomach. He had known that bullying was a problem at Lincoln High, but he had never realized how systematic and widespread Jake's campaign had been. The folder contained evidence of not just bullying, but actual crimes. Jake had been stealing money from students, which was theft. He had physically assaulted several kids, which was battery. He had threatened students with violence, which was intimidation. Principal Williams realized that this wasn't just a school discipline issue anymore. This was something that needed to involve the police. By the next morning, Jake's parents had been called to the school for an emergency meeting. Jake's father, who had always dismissed reports about his son's behavior as boys being boys, was forced to look at video evidence of Jake threatening smaller kids and taking their money. Jake's mother, who had always believed that Jake was just misunderstood, had to watch recordings of her son making other children cry. The meeting didn't go well for Jake. Principal Williams explained that the school had no choice but to expel him immediately. The evidence was too overwhelming, and the behavior had gone on for too long. Jake would not be allowed to return to Lincoln High under any circumstances. His parents would need to find him another school, assuming any school would accept him. With this kind of record, but expulsion was just the beginning. The police officer who had been called to the meeting explained that Jake was facing multiple criminal charges. The district attorney's office had reviewed Alex's evidence and decided to prosecute Jake as an adult for the most serious offenses. Jake could be looking at jail time, community service, and a permanent criminal record that would follow him for the rest of his life. Jake's friends, who had helped him bully other students, were also facing consequences. Tommy and Brad were suspended for 2 weeks and required to attend counseling sessions about bullying and peer pressure. They would also have to write apology letters to every student they had helped Jake torment. Their parents were furious, and both boys realized that their friendship with Jake had cost them far more than they had ever imagined. The students who had been Jake's victims started coming forward once they realized it was safe to speak up. Riley, the freshman who Jake had been cornering in the bathroom, finally told his parents what had been happening. His father was so angry that he threatened to sue the school for not protecting his son. Sam, the sophomore who had been having his money stolen, admitted to his mother why he had been asking for extra lunch money every day. Jordan, the junior who had stopped eating lunch, finally explained why he had been losing weight and seemed so depressed. Each victim's story made Jake's situation worse. The more evidence that came to light, the more serious the charges against him became. What had started as simple bullying was now being treated as a pattern of criminal behavior that had damaged multiple young lives. The other students at Lincoln High were watching all of this happen with amazement. Many of them had been bullied by Jake at some point, but they had never imagined that anything would ever be done about it. Now they were seeing that actions really did have consequences, and that someone who seemed untouchable could actually face justice for their crimes. Alex became something of a legend at school, but not in the way Jake had been. Students respected Alex because he had been smart and patient, because he had protected other people, and because he had done everything the right way. He hadn't used violence to solve his problems. He had used his brain, his training, and his sense of justice to make sure that Jake faced real consequences for his actions. Teachers at Lincoln High were also learning from what had happened. Many of them realized that they had been turning a blind eye to Jake's behavior because it was easier than dealing with the problem. They saw how their action had allowed Jake to hurt so many students over such a long period of time. The school implemented new policies for reporting and investigating bullying, and teachers were required to attend training sessions about recognizing and stopping harassment. Alex's mother finally learned the truth about what had been happening at school when Principal Williams called her to explain the situation. She was proud of her son for handling things the way he did, but she was also sad that he had felt like he couldn't tell her what was going on. They had a long conversation that night about trust, communication, and how to handle difficult situations. Jake's life had completely fallen apart in just a few days. He was expelled from school, facing criminal charges, and had lost all of his friends. His parents were considering moving to another town because they were so embarrassed by what their son had done. Jake himself was required to attend anger management classes and see a therapist to try to understand why he had become someone who hurt other people. The college scholarships that Jake had been hoping for disappeared once the schools heard about his criminal record. His dreams of playing basketball in college were over. His plans for the future had to be completely redesigned around the fact that he was now known as someone who couldn't be trusted. Someone who had used his size and strength to hurt people weaker than himself, but perhaps the most important consequence was what happened to the culture at Lincoln High. Students who had been afraid to speak up about bullying now knew that they would be taken seriously if they reported problems. Kids who had been isolated and picked on found that other students were more willing to be friendly and inclusive. The atmosphere of fear that had hung over the school for years finally began to lift. Alex had accomplished something that nobody thought was possible. He had taken down the school's biggest bully without becoming a bully himself. He had protected other students without putting anyone in danger. He had shown that intelligence and patience could be more powerful than size and aggression. Most importantly, he had proven that bullies aren't as untouchable as they want everyone to believe. Jake's fatal mistake hadn't just been picking the wrong victim. His real mistake had been thinking that his actions would never catch up with him, that he could hurt people without consequences, and that being feared was the same as being respected. Alex had taught him that none of those things were true, and that lesson had cost Jake everything he thought he had built. In the end, Jake learned that the quiet kid sitting alone at lunch might just be the most dangerous person in the room. Not because he's planning to hurt anyone, but because he's planning to make sure that the people who do hurt others finally face justice for their actions.